Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2024 Keep It Clean Pre-Harvest Tips and Tools webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Jeff English. I'm from Pulse Canada, and I'll be moderating today's session. As an export-driven industry, the success of Canadian agriculture depends on steady and predictable access to major international markets, and we know that the decisions made on farm play a key role in keeping these markets open. So before we get started, I'll review the Zoom webinar system and explain how you can participate in today's event. On your screen, you'll see a chat tab and a Q&A tab. Please use the chat tab for hellos and general comments. If you're having any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can throw that in there as well. And please submit questions to the Q&A tab. We'll be going through the questions and respond to them at the end of the webinar, but please submit as you go, just so nothing slips your mind. If we don't get to one of your questions during the Q&A portion, we will follow up with you via email, and you can also feel free to reach out to us anytime at info@keepitclean.ca. And just as a final reminder for you all, today's webinar is being recorded, and a recording of today's session will be emailed out to all participants, as well as posted on keepitclean.ca and YouTube. We do have a lot to cover here this morning, so we'll get started. If you move to the next slide. Let me introduce our three speakers who are with us to provide timely information in advance of the 2024 harvest. Greg Bartley is the Director of Crop Protection and Crop Quality for Pulse Canada. Krista Zuzak is the Director of Crop Protection and Production for Cereals Canada. And Ian Epp is an Agronomy Specialist with the Canola Council of Canada. We're going to kick things off with Krista providing a bit of an overview here. So Krista, if you're ready, I will throw it over to you.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Next slide, please. So as Jeff mentioned, today we're here to have a discussion about some pre-harvest tips and tools. So, this might include thinking about some of the crop protection products that you're using later in the season, potentially scouting for diseases, or anything else you might be thinking about, as your crop matures and towards the end of the season. Next slide, please. And also, Jeff alluded to, just how export dependent our Canadian agriculture industry is. And especially when we think about crops. So in Canada, our crop production far exceeds our domestic demand for food. So therefore, we really do need to make a lot of these export considerations. And hopefully today with the tips and tools that we're sharing, we can help you understand some more, of what we want to think about with Canada's exports going to so many markets and why the decisions we make on the farm and in the field are just so important. And so, for example, in Canada, more than 90% of our canola is exported, and that goes to over 50 countries. When we think about cereal crops, wheat alone currently goes to more than 70 countries, and we export more than 80% of it. And we also see similar stats with pulses, which actually go to more than 130 countries when they leave Canada here via export. Next slide, please. And earlier this year, we also had another webinar. So I also wanted to mention that, and this is available online if this is something you missed through our Keep It Clean webpage. And really, I was there to talk about our product advisory. So throughout today's webinar, we'll be referencing our product advisory. And really, it's there to give additional information about crop protection products, and where we might see market risks in order to want to avoid those. So I just have a summary of it up on the screen. This year, we've also changed the look and feel of our product advisory a little bit with our summary of categorization. So at a glance, you can look at it and you can think about the particular active ingredients. So in your fungicides, your plant growth regulators, pre-harvest weed control or desiccants, what those might look like. And there's also the option to look through these on a crop by crop basis, thinking about what you're growing this year. Next slide, please. So when we think about a product advisory, broadly, these are pesticides that are registered for crop types in Canada. So we are talking about registered uses, but thinking about a product advisory, what we really want to be communicating on is where those additional watch-outs are. So not only what's registered for that crop, but what might be acceptable or, what we might want to be using or avoiding to be used. And the reason for that, again, stems back to market access and our Keep It Clean tagline of growing market-ready crops. So with Canadian crops being exported to so many countries, we not only need to think about our domestic requirements and registrations, but we also need to think about these standards that are set by importing countries, for example. I think it's also, pretty commonly seen in the news about products like glyphosate, for example. But really, we do want to think about, countries have the right to be able to set these standards, these rules, and these regulations for crop protection products, for pesticides used, and for their residues. We also see some additional challenges. So in the phytosanitary and sanitary space, so this has a lot to do not only with residues, but also with plant diseases. Weed seeds are often considered, insects, and it can also impact crop genetics that are used. So with the countries that we export our grains and our other crop types to, we think about these lists that they might have. So they might have certain pests that are regulated or have a zero tolerance for, and we really want to be, focusing on how we can continue to meet those export standards. In addition to all of this, the other complication we have is that, we can also have non-tariff trade barriers, for example, or we can see some of these decisions that aren't necessarily being based on science. And that provides an additional challenge when we really are focusing on, having these standards based in science and based in data. Next slide, please. And in addition to this, I also wanted to flag, that we do see these conversations with customers evolving. So as we have conversations with our customers that are buying Canadian grains or crops from Canada, there are more and more questions being asked. And as I mentioned, whether they're about weed seeds or they might be about particular diseases. So we really want to use, our Keep It Clean platform to communicate these out so we can really think about, the importance of these decisions at the field level. So, whether this is your management of certain diseases like blackleg or fusarium that I'll talk more about, the products that you're using as pesticides and the residues they may have, or managing your weeds through the use of herbicides. And another one I wanted to flag is often, we talk about pesticides and pesticide residues, but there are also other factors that we have to consider for market access. So not only maximum residue limits in MRLs, but also maximum limits. So these can be for things like contaminants or heavy metals. Next slide, please. And one of particular consideration to think about is something like fusarium head blight in cereals. So, throughout the season when you're out there scouting for disease, you're looking for it, early to be able to hit that ideal spray timing, but also later in the season if perhaps that spray timing was missed or, other things happen that we can't predict in the field and we have that wet year, we might see symptoms later that we want to be thinking about sending those harvested grain samples in for testing. And what we're really looking for here is the presence of mycotoxins. So mycotoxins such as deoxynivalenol that can be produced by fusarium head blight. When we look at that, countries outside of Canada or, countries that we might export to may have maximum limits in place for DON. So we don't want to see, fusarium producing DON and seeing issues in our exports. So really, if we're able to, provide tools through Keep It Clean and, through agronomists and through discussions that we're having, we're better able to manage fusarium and really manage it at the field level, or at harvest and before it's exported from there. Next slide. So, when we think about the tools that growers have and agronomists, we also think about the approaches that industry are taking. So, industry as a whole and working collectively, we do try to take kind of short, medium, and longer term approaches to be able to manage some of these challenges and address some of these, in addition to what we do through the Keep It Clean program. And, when we think of the longer term approach, often this has to do with advocacy. So this might be multiple commodities working together, multi-countries even working together, work happening through organizations like the Canada Grains Council to really work on some of those advocacy efforts. And that would include, that advocacy for taking science-based approaches to policy and to those decisions that they might be making around some of these trade barriers. And then we think more on the shorter term, this has a lot more to do with perhaps monitoring of, MRLs or these crop issues that we might see, changes in maximum residue limits or maximum limits. And another strategy is really try to provide this information to growers and agronomists and also have communication with our exporters that can help manage this, this short-term risk of an MRL non-compliance, for example. And so with that, to talk more about the shorter term approach and some of the tools that we're using, next slide, please. And I'm going to pass it over to Ian Epp from the Canola Council.
Thanks, Krista. The Keep It Clean program, it's a joint initiative between a couple of commodity groups. You see their symbols there. We're providing timely updates, so potential market risks, resources for on-farm practices, and it's funded through the agri-marketing program. We'll jump right into the kind of the practical short-term things you want to think about throughout this growing season. Next slide. So we have 5 tips we want to talk about. These haven't changed in a while, but it's really important to reiterate what we're talking about here and why, maybe what it matters now. And I think I'm going to really focus on, the 2024 growing season between now and putting the grain in the bin, or once getting the grain to the bin, that's how that kind of makes sure it makes sense to you in the short-term details. So using acceptable pesticides only. What does that mean? Pesticides that are both registered for your crop in Canada and don't create trade concerns. When we look at the pesticides, if you look into our product advisories, which we're going to talk about later, these are created based on products that are registered on your product. So if it's not registered on your crop, we probably haven't looked at it. There might not know. So just because you don't see anything on our website, make sure it is a registered product. That's just a key kind of fundamental step for everything that flows out of there. If in doubt with anything, always talk to your grain buyer. Sometimes maybe you do have something that's been a little bit offside or you're not quite sure. Your grain buyer will know those things and will be able to walk you through it. And maybe if there is something that's a little bit trickier to deal with, they might have a special market that's safe to deal with a crop that maybe doesn't meet all of our market demands. But step 1 is getting those pesticides, making sure they're registered. Next slide. Tip number 2, read and follow the label. Again, product is registered. Now we need to follow the label. When we look at, in the various commodity groups, when we look at assessing risk, is there a residue issue here? Is there a market access issue? That's based on the rate or following the label. That's on probably the highest label rate, probably maybe worst case scenario, but worst case scenario on the label. So if we get off label, suddenly we might see residues that haven't been anticipated for the grain buyer's not aware of, and suddenly now we do have market risk. And unfortunately, that causes a lot of problems and can be traced back down to the farm or a bin. So again, rate is, the right rate. We want to assess the right rate, use the right rate is both good for agronomically. You might see crop damage if you apply it to the incorrect rate, but also residue issues, timing, when we're applying it, and that pre-harvest interval or PHI. That's the time, the number of days between spraying and straight cutting the crop. That's really critical, especially this year as we look at towards the end of the season, or we're kind of in the back half of the season. Anything we do now, there's a lot of products that have 1 day or 7-day PHIs, but also 30 and 45-day PHIs. And for some of our earliest crop, we're going to start getting into that window here really soon. So looking at which products are available, you might have a suite of products, maybe 2 or 3 products that agronomically are very similar. They could work on addressing a situation, but they might have different PHIs. So one might be a little bit of a safer to reduce risk in case you do end up harvesting it a little quick or you're kind of getting into that window. Next slide. Managing disease pressure. Again, we talked about this can be a market access issue. Some diseases are more of a market access issue than others, but in general, there's good agronomic incentive to be managed as well as this a market access component. So disease-resistant varieties, crop rotation, planting good seeds, IPM wherever you can kind of integrate or layer in another tool in there. Just really key for doing that. And I guess probably for this type of year is probably scouting to identify. You've probably gone through a lot of these steps already. You've planted your seeds. You've kind of gone through is identifying, is my plan working, or is there something I need to change for next year because I am seeing, a creep of blackleg. Blackleg is slowly getting worse in my canola fields or something like that. Or, we're high fusarium pressure this year, and I don't know if I'm properly addressing that. Next slide. Storing your crop. Cleaning your bins, getting them clean well ahead of harvest, making sure they're dry. Any pests have been dealt with. If you do have pests or you are concerned about pests, make sure you're using approved bin treatments. This is a sneaky one. A lot of growers don't have problems with bugs in their bins every year. It might have been 4 or 5 years since you had a problem. Making sure you're using the right product. In canola, it's really key that we don't use malathion. Diatomaceous earth on cereals, those kind of things. And then keeping your bins cool, dry, ventilated, anything to reduce the risk of disease pests in your bins. But again, that's one of those kind of sneaky ones where it might have been several years. So just keeping in mind and being well prepared ahead of harvest solves a lot of those problems. Next slide. Deliver what you declare. Tip number 5. Again, we have to be upfront with what we're declaring. So hopefully we've gone through all of the other tips. You know, we've applied products on label, we've applied the right rate, we've done all the various things, and then we, you know, maybe some record keeping is important, and then actually reading the declaration to understand that this is what I'm declaring. You know, being upfront with what you have. And again, if you do have something you're not sure about, talking to your grain buyer, asking specific questions about what this means. And, you know, again, if there is something that's maybe a gray area or you're not quite sure, your grain buyer might have a second market that can deal with that if they're aware. Worst case scenario is something goes into the mainstream, it gets shipped and rejected down the stream, and then they back trace it all the way back, and we have this problem. So again, dealing with that, you know, reading through your declaration, making sure you're on side with everything, and if in question, talking to your grain buyer. Next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Greg to talk about tools and resources.
Great. Thanks, Ian. So yeah, we just want to provide a quick overview of the tools and resources you can find on the Keep It Clean website to help, you know, take into the field and really keep market access at the forefront when we're in the field and doing agronomic practices. So when you get to the website, you'll find this tools and resources sections. And the three key ones that we want to highlight is really that pre-harvest staging guide, our product advisory, and pre-harvest interval calculator. But there's also, you know, this webinar and past webinars you can find in the webinars tab, and there's shareable content, graphics online to help extend this messaging too. That, you know, if we're working directly with growers or want to get the message out there, you know, we do provide resources to help extend that message that's available for anyone to use. So we'll dig into a couple of these in a little more detail if we go to the next slide. Obviously, the first one I mentioned, the pre-harvest staging guide. So this is where we really want to highlight, you know, the proper application of pre-harvest glyphosate. You know, when Ian talked about the tips, you know, tip number 1 and tip number 2, whether it's use acceptable pesticides only, and then always read and follow the label. You know, when we get to the application of glyphosate, you know, we've already talked to our grain buyer. We've determined that, yeah, no, we're in a situation where it's acceptable. So now it comes down to proper application timing. So the reason we see so much attention to pre-harvest glyphosate and the application timing is the application timing is super critical to make sure we don't cause those residue concerns in our export markets. So this really comes down to 30% moisture content. So we're making sure that when we do get in there and apply it, the moisture content is less than 30% in the least matured part of the field. This is to make sure that residues aren't getting into the grain or translocating with their plant, since that glyphosate is a herbicide, it's not a desiccant, and just making sure we get that timing correctly. So we're going to have more information on this as we go along. Just wanted to highlight this tool. It's available for you, and hopefully it's helpful throughout the growing season. Next slide. The second tool I mentioned is a product advisory. So as Kristen mentioned earlier, we did a whole webinar on this early in the season. So definitely go back and check that out if you didn't watch it. But really, this is just to make sure that we're communicating any products that may pose a market risk if it's applied on farm. So these are registered products. The intent of this is that, you know, we really don't have, it's really not clear, I guess, when you're applying products, you know, what are the potential market access implications in those export markets. It's not on the label. That's not readily available. So we do a lot of the work behind the scenes to make sure that we're looking at the MRLs, we're assessing that potential residue risk, and then if we do deem that there's a market where that risk is either too great, you know, we can provide a do not use classification and just communicate to ask growers not to use that product. That potential is too big. Or there could be a situation where there's a certain market where there's an issue or a certain situation where there is a potential risk, but it's not for everyone. So that's where we get you to go talk to your grain buyer, have that conversation, see if that grain buyer is in that situation where they're exporting that crop to a sensitive market. And then they can provide direction if it's acceptable or not based on where they export their crops to. Next slide. And finally, the other tool, and hopefully you find this useful, is a pre-harvest interval calculator. So again, just to highlight again, you know, a pre-harvest interval is just that minimum number of days that must pass between application timing and cutting of the crop. So when we say cutting, this could either be, you know, direct harvesting where there's a combine, or if you're in a situation where you're still swathing your crop, you know, it's the timing of swathing. So not harvest in that indication, it's when that crop is cut. That's the time how we calculate our PHI. So what this calculator does is we've gone through all the product labels and tried to pull the PHI information for all those products, and we made it available in this calculator. So you can go online, you can choose your crops. This is just available for canola and pulse crops, and you can either choose to find the PHI by the product. So if you apply to a specific product, you can look up the PHI for that product. And new for this year is we've added active ingredient information to this as well. So say you've used, you're trying to find a product based on active ingredients, you can click on that button. It'll show you all the products with that active ingredient in it. And then you can help filter it down that way too. So hopefully a little more functionality to get the most out of this, this tool. Alternatively, there's another way to use this calculator where, say it's coming up to harvest time, say you only have 30 days left, you're trying to find all the products that fit within that time frame. You can then use the second function on this calculator to, pick your herbicide or desiccant or insecticide. Say it's, you have an insect problem. Click that button, and then you can filter down to when you expect to harvest that crop, and it'll filter out all the products that fit within that PHA timeframe. So again, just another way to look at the information, and hopefully it's you can find it useful. Another functionality, again, if you want to sync it to your calendar, say you know your PHI, you have the product, you enter in when you sprayed it, and then it can set a reminder in the calendar to when that PHI is passed too. So, providing the options for you to make sure that it's nice and user-friendly, and that PHI information is readily available. Next slide. So from here on out, we're going to switch to kind of more crop-specific information that we just want to highlight. So from here, I'm going to jump into the pulse considerations. So next slide. So a lot of questions that I get every year is what pre-harvest product can I use on my pulses? We have the product advisory available. It only lists a couple of products, but what about the other products? So I just want to make it very clear that when we look at the product advisory, this is only listing products that do have that marketing concern. So if it's not on the product, if it's not on the advisory and it's a registered product, you should be okay to use it. Just to quickly summarize our product advisory again for this season, there's only 2 products on the advisory for pulse crops this year. It's for pre-harvest, it's for glyphosate, so pre-harvest use of glyphosate. This is a yellow classification for all of our pulse crops, so chickpeas, green lentils, peas, fava beans, dry beans. It just means that go talk to your grain buyer, just see if there's any potential concerns with using that. To highlight again, that's not due to MRL concerns. There's MRL is established in all of our export markets. However, it's due to the market acceptance issues with glyphosate. We just knew that the consumer perception, there's certain challenges with this product. So just a good idea to go talk to your grain buyer to see if you're in a situation where there may be a situation where they're not asking you to use it. The other product we have on here is glyphosate ammonia. So this has a couple of different classifications, which unfortunately not showing on the slide here. So you got to go to the website to check out the classifications, but I'll walk you through it. So in lentils in Western Canada, this is a red do not use. It's very clear, do not use this product on lentils in Western Canada. For dry beans in Eastern Canada, we do have a registration over there, and the registration is different between Eastern and Western Canada, but we have a yellow classification for dry beans in Eastern Canada. The MRL situation is exactly the same, where it's not good. So it's a very limited use, but there is a certain market where dry beans, the glyphosate on dry beans is allowed. So you need to go talk to your grain buyer to make sure that, if you're in that situation, is this an acceptable product? And if it is, then obviously you can proceed with that application. I want to highlight peas here in Western Canada as well. Glyphosate is not registered on peas. So it's a very clear, do not use this product. It's not registered, and we ask you to only use registered products. Again, as Ian talked about earlier, if you start to using products off label, there are serious residue implications with that, as if you don't have the label, chances are the MRL is not in place too, so the use of that product will cause a market access concern. So highlight again too, a couple of products came off the advisory, Cytoxan chlorothalonil. Those are on the advisory last year. They're off the advisory this year. So if you're in a situation where if you have these products and you're going to use them, no market access considerations to worry about. You're free to use those products. Understanding right in fungicide season right now, so that chlorothalonil one is definitely front and center for chickpea growers probably right now. So again, highlights, if you don't see a product on the advisory, so we're talking about diquat, saflufenicil, carfentrazone, flumioxazin, all products that are safe to use on pulse crops this growing season as a desiccant. Feel free to use those as a management tool. Next slide. So getting into a little more detail about those 2 products that do appear on the advisory, so pre-harvest glyphosate considerations. So when you've talked to your grain buyer, you're okay to use. Again, as I mentioned before, it's really critical we get the application timing correctly and we're using this properly, using the product properly. So what does that mean? Just to reiterate, hopefully you've heard these points many times, but it's okay to reiterate these many times. Glyphosate is registered for pre-harvest weed control. It's not a desiccant. That's not how we're using this product. So we're going in to control the pre-harvest weeds in our crops. When we are applying, it's very important to make sure that we're applying it once grain moisture content is less than 30% in the least mature part of the field. Again, applying too early or above 30% moisture content, you're going to get that translocation of the plant. It's going to get into the seed, and that's where we can see residues beyond what the MRL is in our export markets. That's when we get into trouble. So making sure that we're below 30% moisture content. We want to make sure we're following the label for application rate, timing, pre-harvest interval. And just to highlight here, the PHI for glyphosate is 7 days. The label states that you can harvest within 7 to 14 days. But for the sake of how the residues, residue trials were conducted, PHI of 7 days was used. So that's what we're going to go by and make sure that we're not harvesting before 7 days after it's been applied. And then again, just to highlight again here too, that when you're using pre-harvest glyphosate and you're tank mixing this product, and this goes for any product, when you're tank mixing, you have to follow the label with that has the most restrictive use pattern. So in this instance, example, if you have pre-harvest glyphosate into your tank mixing with saflufenicil or heat, pre-harvest glyphosate would have the longer PHI on that label, so that's what we got to follow. So even though saflufenicil has a shorter PHI, it's pre-harvest glyphosate or that most restrictive product label they have to follow. That's for any product that you're tank mixing. You're always in that situation. Next slide. So again, if you need some help with assessing pre-harvest glyphosate application timing, again, we do have that pre-harvest glyphosate staging guide. We do provide kind of visual examples, some detailed information of what you find on the label of what to look for. Again, 30% moisture content, it's typically difficult to go out there and assess moisture content specifically. So we're always using that visual characterizations. We're looking at color change, do the pods rattle, things like that. So again, all that information is detailed on this pre-harvestation guide. However, I do recommend that if you are looking for more detailed information, there are more guides out there. So go to the grower organization. So Saskatchewan Pulse Grower, as an example, has a really detailed guide for lentils. Definitely encourage you to go check those resources out if you're looking for more detailed information that provides more information of what's too early, what's correct, what's too late, and things like that. Next slide. Finally, just want to highlight on glyphosate and ammonium. So as I mentioned on that product advisory, we do have a bunch of classifications here. Just want to make it very clear. Glyphosate should not be used on any pulse crop due to missing and missing aligned MRLs in export markets. So even though we do have generic registrations of glyphosate on lentils in Western Canada, do not use this product. That message is just crystal clear. Do not use the product. If you use that product, we will get detectable residues. The MRLs are not established in export markets. It will cause a non-compliance, and it's just a situation we need to avoid as an industry. This can cause damage, and we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to protect our market access for everyone within the industry. So do not use it on lentils. For any other pulse crops, we're talking about peas, chickpeas, whatever it is, it's not labeled. The generic registration in Western Canada is on lentils only. There is no other label for glyphosate on pulse crops. So don't use it. It's off label. It's illegal. Again, same situation. If it is used, those residue concerns are still present, and it will cause those market access concerns. So again, do not use glyphosate on pulse crops. For Eastern Canada, I did highlight that dry bean registration in Eastern Canada on glyphosate. Again, in most cases, the recommendation will be not to use that product as well. It's a very specific use pattern on a market class that we typically see this product being allowed. Majority of cases, it's going to cause a market access concern. So cannot stress enough to go talk to your grain buyer if you're thinking about using glyphosate on dry beans in Eastern Canada, just to make sure that you're going into that specific market. If you're not, it's going to cause a concern, and it's just a situation we need to avoid. Next slide. I'm going to pass it back to Ian to talk about some canola considerations.
All right. Next slide. We'll get right into it. So we don't have as many issues. We have nothing on our product advisory. So again, if you follow the label on all the products, you go through those 5 tips that I went through earlier, you should be good to go. That being said, that makes it sound very easy. Like Greg mentioned, things like glyphosate, there is always this we have to get the timing right. We have to get the rate right. We have to get all those steps right in order to have no issues. So looking at glyphosate obviously is, widely applied. We need to get this right in canola as well as all the other crops. So getting this timing right, that's probably the most critical thing now, one of the most critical things now between now and harvest time. So pre-harvest glyphosate, we're looking at 50 to 60% seed color change. That would be kind of your old swath timing. Your bottom pods are going to be completely brown or black. You're going to have some in the middle that are kind of in between. Your top ones are green and firm to roll. Again, you can apply glyphosate a little bit later than this, but earlier is where we're going to have issues. So that's kind of that minimum 50 to 60%, or that grain moisture that will be less than 30%. Harvest is going to be 7 to 14 days after this. The one thing here is, maybe we have an uneven crop. You've had some hail damage or something has happened. The bottom, we're looking at the most immature part of the field. So we want, if their parts are past that, that's all right. You're right. Your sand ridges are drying out and are already ahead of that. That's fine. But again, we're looking at that green or immature parts of the field because that's where we're going to have detectable residue. So field averages work great when the field is very uniform, but we do have these fields that end up being pretty ununiform. So how you want to approach that, whether you want to harvest parts of the field later or just wait till the whole field is prepared, or maybe in some cases glyphosate isn't the right tool for this crop. We have swathing opportunities, we have other desiccants that are in there at different timings. Maybe one of those has a better fit, but again, we're looking at 30% moisture content, that 50 to 60% seed color change in canola. Next slide. Pre-harvest scouting for blackleg. So I mentioned that disease issues can be a problem, both agronomically and from a market access standpoint. Blackleg is the big one in canola that can be a problem. And again, you want to be dealing with blackleg regardless. So this is just maybe an extra incentive to be out there scouting. This time of year, there's lots of, I briefly outlined some of the opportunities to control blackleg at different stages. At this point, most of those have passed, and it's just mostly assessing what has happened this year. What is my blackleg looking like? Is the program I have in place working, or do I need to make a change? So this rating scale, again, we're doing this at 60% seed color change. So while you're looking at, do I apply glyphosate to this crop, you can be assessing for blackleg at the same time. There's a rating scale there. There's more information at canolacalculator.ca or blackleg.ca if you want more information. But again, rating this is really, really important. And the other thing I would highlight, just, it's not just the market access, it's not just this, but at a number 2 on that scale, which is pretty common across the prairies, we see lots of fields with a 2, you're losing almost 10% of your yield. So if you need an extra incentive in there to get out and scout for blackleg, I don't know, one of these things, it's a really important disease to be checking. And now it's just a matter of assessing, is my program working? Is it not working? Again, there's kind of details there on how many plants, and you want to kind of look throughout the field. And there's lots of tools. There's lots of opportunity to control blackleg. So for future planning, as you're purchasing seed for next year, as you're planning out crop rotations, lots of opportunities. But right now, between now and harvest, it's just a matter of assessing, is my current program working? Next slide. Integrated blackleg management. So yeah, again, there's lots of things. We can rotate our crops. Scouting is really important now. Different seed varieties, you have different labels, so you can be a little more specific in what resistance genes you're going for. There's fungicide options, and again, controlling your volunteer canola or your other brassica weeds in your off years. Lots of opportunity to manage this disease. And yet I think if we look across the provincial disease surveys in all 3 provinces, we've seen slight increases, or in some cases substantial increases in blackleg in the prairie. So again, one of these things that it's kind of a sneaky disease. You might not notice it. It doesn't have the wow factor of verticillium or sclerotinia, but again, it's pretty common to be losing 5 or 10% of your yield to blackleg. Next slide. I already talked about keeping your bins free. Malathion is the big one in canola. We can't put canola in bins treated with malathion. That's where we get residues. It's not registered for that, or that's where we have problems. Malathion applied as per the label in the crop, great, but in the bin, we end up with detection. It's not very common, but again, it's one of those things that if you don't have bugs or issues with the bins for a number of years, and then suddenly it happens and you pull the trigger on something, and now record keeping or which canola is going in what bin, things get moved around, especially if harvest gets wet or complicated and grain moves. So keeping your canola bins malathion free is just, it's critical. It lingers for months, so it doesn't matter when you treated that bin. If you treated it in June and you're going to put canola in it in September, you might still have an issue, making it unacceptable for export, and it is definitely detectable. Next slide. Pre-harvest intervals for late season insecticides. I throw this in there just because we're never quite sure what the last part of the season is going to bring. There's a number of late season insects that can affect canola or any of the crops. And you have a number of insecticides that are kind of, they do similar jobs. Agronomically, they're very similar. and yet you might see differences in the pre-harvest interval. And maybe when you're reading through the crop protection guide or where you're getting information, you kind of skip over the pre-harvest interval. If you apply most things at the regular timing, pre-harvest intervals usually aren't the most restrictive thing, right? You want to apply something up to the 6th leaf in canola, pre-harvest interval, you're good. You got lots of extra room there. But insecticides you can apply or might need to apply right up into very close to harvest. So just looking at some, there's a number of them that have the 1-day pre-harvest interval, so that's pretty great. A couple have 7, and there is the odd one that has a 30 or 35-day pre-harvest interval. So again, looking at the list of pests controlled, you might just pull the trigger on an insecticide because it's in the shed and it does control that pest. But this is kind of really important to keep in mind as we get really tight to harvest, especially if we do have an insect that maybe you haven't sprayed for grasshoppers late season in many, many years, or maybe we do get a bit of a Bertha outbreak somewhere. Some of these late season insects do need to be controlled pretty close to harvest. So just that timing is critical. This calculator is really, really helpful. You can search by and quickly figure out, just make sure you're good on that. Because again, lots of opportunity, lots of options there. We just got to pull the right, get the right product on at the right time. Next slide. That's it for canola. I will turn it over to Krista.
Thanks, Ian, and thank you, Greg. And before I get into our cereal-specific considerations for pre-harvest, I did also want to remind you that on our Keep It Clean website, we do have a pre-harvest glyphosate video that's available to watch or as a shareable resource. So today I really do want to focus on kind of assessing that 30% moisture in cereal crops and then any other considerations we might have for 2024. Next slide, please. So Greg did a really good job of walking through what our pre-harvest glyphosate staging guide is all about. And so we do have some specific considerations for cereals, but again, driving you to that resource on our website and really thinking about, glyphosate's registered use and it's registered for pre-harvest weed control. And we don't want to, see it being used as a desiccant. It is a very important tool for our growers. So, using it properly not only helps us avoid those residue issues, but also keeps that tool available. Next slide, please. So when we think about assessing a field for this 30% moisture, I'm going to use wheat as the example and then chat through a few of the differences and also where we see it in the advisories for wheat, barley, and for oats. So for cereals, we really want to think about where we're assessing the field. So you want to be going to that least mature area of the field. And this is also because this is where these residue issues are, most likely if we have some differences in maturity. And we really want to be conducting that staging based on that least mature location and being careful that we're not, using the field average and, cutting it a little bit too close there. And the key part in cereals that we want to focus on is right below the head on the stem. So we want to ensure that we've lost all of that green color. So once we reach that stage in our plants, they're physiologically mature, and that's where we want to think about that application for a 30% or less moisture. So on your screen, you'll see in the top image, the stem just below the head in the first wheat plant. On the right, it's still, or on the left, I should say, it's really still quite green. That middle plant we see, it's more in that clearing stage. So it's clearing some of the green, but it's not quite ready still. And then when we look at the third image of the wheat head there, you see that's cleared the green, and this is at that physiological maturity that we're looking for. The next stage here is really thinking about hand threshing or shelling out some of those the grains from the wheat head, and we want to assess the kernels for this moisture level. So we often call this the thumbnail test. So it's applying that pressure to the kernel with your thumbnail and looking at where the indent is. So if the indent doesn't spring back and it remains, they're at that hard dough stage, and that would be that 30% or less moisture level, where you're safe to be making that pre-harvest glyphosate application. Next slide. So as I mentioned, now I'm going to talk through just briefly the differences for wheat, for barley, and for oats. Essentially, it's the same thumbnail test that we're looking at. We want to think about the same factors and that 30% or less grain moisture. But one other flag I wanted to make is in areas of regrowth, and with regrowth in cereals especially, we can see some of that late tillering. So we haven't seen that in the last few years as much, but I know maybe 2 or 3 years ago now, we did have a year where we saw some secondary growth in that late tillering. And especially if those tillers are going to make it to some seed production by harvest timing, this is something that can really skew that grain moisture assessment. Or, as I mentioned, you want to think about that least mature part of the field. Also keeping in mind your pre-harvest interval. So as Ian talked about and Greg also mentioned, for cereals, we're looking at that 7 to 14 day window between our pre-harvest glyphosate application and cutting or harvesting that crop, really to make sure that we avoid some of those unnecessary residues building up. And then on wheat specifically, so it has a yellow or an amber classification. So wheat may not be accepted if it's treated with pre-harvest glyphosate. So we really do want to encourage you to have those conversations with your grain buyers before you're using this product on wheat that's going to be exported. Next slide, please. When we think about barley, so barley has a few more considerations to be made, the same considerations for grain moisture and about that interval that we're looking at. But on malt barley specifically, it's a red as part of our advisory. So it's a do not use pre-harvest glyphosate on malt barley as it won't be accepted by grain buyers. Versus when we think about barley for food and feed, this is where it's an amber or a yellow similar to wheat. So it may or may not be accepted if it's being treated with pre-harvest glyphosate. So we want to have that conversation with your grain buyer before you make that application. And for malt barley, especially when they are restricting the use of pre-harvest glyphosate, it's to do with the malting process and also to do with market access. Next slide. And finally, when we look at oats, again, the same considerations that we're making about grain moisture and about that pre-harvest timing. And for all of those crops, we do want to think about, using that thumbnail test to be able to assess that moisture level. And where oats fall on our product advisories, they're also an amber or a yellow. So oats may not be accepted if they're treated with pre-harvest glyphosate. Next slide, please. And just to wrap up of our product advisory for cereals, so kind of some of the later season considerations we may make. We walked through glyphosate in quite a bit of detail, but the other one that I did want to flag for pre-harvest weed control is saflufenicil or heat. So Greg also mentioned this one, and the only advisory we have for that one is on malt barley. So malt barley will not be accepted if heat was used as a pre-harvest weed control agent on it, again because it impacts the malting process that we see for malt barley. And Greg already touched on it as well, but on our product advisory, if there's products that you don't see on there and they're registered for use in wheat and barley and oats, or wheat or barley and oats, then there's no advisory, and you're generally good to go on those products as long as they're registered for that specific crop. And we also want to remind you to follow the label on that one. Next slide, please. So with that, we do really want to, make those considerations on farm and in the field when we're, following those labels and thinking about, the pre-harvest intervals, the application timelines, and, what Ian went through about the rates and other factors, so that we can really, keep that market access open. Next slide. And just to wrap up, I wanted to provide a reminder that we do have that a lot of tools and resources available under one of our tabs on keepitclean.ca. So this includes links to a lot of what you've heard about today, including our pre-harvest glyphosate staging guides, those videos. Our product advisory is available there, the pre-harvest interval calculator that was discussed, as well as recordings of previous webinars, and today's webinar will also be available there. And if you're interested for your organization, we do also have a lot of shareable content and graphics there, and some news and updates that we provide on a timely basis. Next slide. So with this, I'll pass it back to Jeff.
Thanks, Krista, and thank you to all the panelists, not only for the specific information on crops, but the general overview on the tools and resources that can be found on the site. We do have a few questions here, and just a reminder, if anything pops into your head, please throw it into the Q&A portion of the webinar, and we'll get to it. First up, guess for Ian here. How do I know if my canola crops are at the right stage for glyphosate? Is it necessary to check the entire field? I think you touched a bit on that, but if you want to.
Yeah, it's that 30% seed color or seed moisture, which is 60 to 50 or 50 to 60% seed color change. So again, swap timing. You want to check the least mature part of your field. Probably if you've been looking at your field throughout the season, you know where the greenest patches or the least mature parts are for now, or you can make an educated guess. It's the low spot, or it's the area that there was a lower plant stand or something. By now, if you're checking for all the other agronomic issues, you kind of know. So you should be checking the whole field, I guess, but you can kind of strategically figure out where those parts are. And again, how you manage them is really up to you, whether glyphosate's not the right fit, whether you wait until that timing. So it is now acceptable. It's 50 to 60% seed color change. Different products, swathing, different types of, harvesting part of the field at a different timing. There's lots of different ways of managing that, but the key is that we don't have the glyphosate going on too early.
Great, thanks, Ian. Greg Bartley, I think this one's for you. What effects can early glyphosate application have on pulse crops?
Yeah, so if you apply glyphosate too early, like obviously we talked about the residue implications, where you'll see that glyphosate residues translocate within the plant and get into the seed, and that's where we get our MRL concerns. But also, if you apply too early, there is agronomic considerations too. That seed may not have fully developed yet. You could be losing yield potential with that. So definitely quality implications too. So multiple reasons why we need to get that timing correct, and that's waiting till at least for 30% moisture content in the least mature part of the field.
Okay, thanks, Greg. This next one, maybe Krista, or open it up to anyone. Are there any special considerations that should be given in the areas that have seen excess or a lot of moisture this year? I know it's sporadic and we're covering a big area, but certainly there are pockets of here in Manitoba and elsewhere that have seen more rain than normal. Are there things that folks should be considering as they enter those fields in advance of harvest?
Sure. So maybe I'll start that one off, Jeff, and then I'll open it up to our other presenters. Again, I think it would depend what happens closer to when you're going to be making that application timing, but that can also, impact some of those secondary growth that we might see, or, tillers, or really just impact kind of the maturity. So depending what that moisture looks like across the field, and we really do want to be focusing on, assessing that least mature part of the crop and how that might be affected by having some of that moisture this year.
Yeah, anytime you have lots of moisture or something like that, the uniformity starts to go down on the crop, and maybe you've lost some plants, maybe you'll get more tillering, or maybe you have more side branches or something else coming. So a more significant part of your yield might be coming from a different part of the plant. So again, it gets much more it's easy to say assess the least mature part of your field, but it can get pretty complicated in where your yields come in, where are those least mature parts. So thorough scouting is really important. The one thing with glyphosate, we have had some of the crops are maybe a little bit behind. We were a little cooler in June. Maybe this heat will speed it up, but kind of messing with the crop timing a little bit. Glyphosate, it's key to know what glyphosate will do for your crop and what it won't do. So it's great at drying down weeds. It'll kill those weeds that are in your crop. It's not going to speed up your crop maturity, right? There's desiccants. There's true desiccants for that. So keep in mind that if you are getting a little antsy as we get into harvest because your crop is behind schedule, there are tools to help speed up crop maturity, but glyphosate's not one of them. The swather is one of them. Desiccants are one of them. So again, other tools of ways to manage that, especially in uneven fields, just different approaches to that. But certainly excess moisture will cause some grief in those areas.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, we know it could be a stressful time too. Everyone's, dealing with excess moisture can be challenging. And, if that trend progresses right into the harvest time too, it's not even just harvest implications that we're thinking about. We're thinking about how to properly store that crop too. Krista did talk about that, and both Ian talked about, storing that crop properly too. So if we are harvesting, it needs to be dried down, making sure we're getting proper storage, moisture content, that just reduces the chance for those mycotoxins developing in storage too. So lots of considerations if this trend does continue, and make sure that we're not pushing harvest, making sure we're not getting in there and trying to speed things up as much as we can, but also recognize that it can be stressful, and we do feel for you if you're in that situation.
Thanks, everyone. One from the chat here too, and maybe to the best of your abilities. The question pertains to products being applied, off-label usage with drones. I'm not sure that there'd be a differentiation between that and regular spraying, but maybe open that up to the group if you're hearing or seeing any questions or comments around that.
I won't beat you to it, Ian, if you want to go.
Okay, I'll take a start at it, and you can fill in what I all miss. One thing to consider is it is an off-label application at this point, right? We don't have a classification for drones, so first and foremost, it's an illegal application. I think we probably will see a rule change come at some point in the future with drones, some sort of classification. We do see that in other jurisdictions, so hopefully that happens. I think there is opportunity for drones to play a role, but currently it is an off-label application. For pesticides, fertility products you can apply. So there is a kind of or inoculants, other products that aren't registered in the same way can be applied. So not every drone spray, if you do see a drone spraying something in a field, it may not be an off-label application, but pesticides, it is an off-label application. I don't know if there's any, from a Keep It Clean program, it's an off-label application. I think that's kind of the beginning and the end of this specific problem. That being said, we're looking mostly at residues, trade risk. At the moment, again, it shouldn't be happening. If it's not causing a trade risk, I guess I would put it largely just outside the purview of the Keep It Clean program. I think broader in agriculture, this is something that's interesting. It's definitely an upcoming thing, and there's definitely utility to it. But again, at this point, it's off-label, and I guess that's where this conversation ends, unless Greg has more.
Yeah, I just want to say that we're all excited by the technology, but we need to make sure that we have the proper labels in place before we implement that technology. So, through the conversations that we have, and in our conversation with the PMRA, we do know it is a priority to get that registered on labels. So, lots of work at an international level to make sure we have the right data to do a proper risk assessment. So, we are paying attention to it. We are encouraging the PMRA to get moving and get going on it, but we do know that does take some time, which can be frustrating. So. It's on our radar. We'd like to see it implemented, and hopefully we get there sooner rather than later.
Great, thanks. Thanks, everyone. That's going to be all for today. So just a few final notes before we go. As you exit, if you could complete the feedback survey that'll pop up on your screen, we would greatly appreciate it. Your comments do help inform content and of our future webinars. And just as a reminder, we'll be emailing out the link to the webinar recording and a reminder to fill out a feedback survey in the next couple of days. You're welcome to share the recording or really any Keep It Clean resources amongst your networks. You're encouraged to do so. And for those of you who are interested in getting CEUs for participating in the webinar today, we will be submitting a list of those who have attended and who have applied. So if we don't yet have your CCA number, if it's missing, please email it to us at info@keepitclean.ca and we'll get you added to the list. So thank you to our panelists today, and thank you to everybody who's joined. And I want to wish you a great rest of the day and a productive Harvest 2024.